From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello again. I'm Bob Patrick, Director of the Veterans History Project. Glad to have each and every one of you here this afternoon. Rajiv Chandrasekaran is an author, a journalist, and is now leading a production company associated with Starbucks to create nonfiction documentaries about issues that matter to Americans, with an initial focus on veterans. He was previously a senior correspondent and associate editor of the Washington Post. He served as the Post's national editor and assistant managing editor and as a bureau chief in Baghdad, Cairo, and Southeast Asia. He is the author of Little America, The War Within the War for Afghanistan, and Imperial Life in the Emerald City, Inside Iraq's Green Zone, a best-selling account of the troubled American effort to reconstruct Iraq. The book won the Overseas Press Club Book Award, was named one of the 10 best books of 2007 by the New York Times, and is a finalist for the National Book of the Year. His reporting for the Post was recognized with honors from the Overseas Press Club and Society of Professional Journalists. In 2014, Rajiv co-authored with Howard Schultz, CEO of Starbucks, a book titled For Love of Country: What Our Veterans Can Teach Us About Citizenship, Heroism, and Sacrifice. For Love of Country, a bestseller, profiles men and women who have in some way been personally affected by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Each chapter in the book is a story about valor, perseverance, trauma, or resilience. Mr. Chandrasekaran and Mr. Schultz spotlight these stories to inform and instruct an American society that has often been unaware of the veterans in their midst and the value that they bring to their communities. It encourages readers to connect with the veterans in their community and recommend that one way of doing so is to listen to their stories, a sentiment we wholeheartedly endorse at the Veterans History Project. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Rajiv Chandrasekaran.
Good afternoon. Thanks for sticking with it this long in the day. Just a simply remarkable event here put on by the Library of Congress, and I'm deeply grateful for what they've done this year and what they do every year around this time of year with this festival. Let's keep it a little casual today, but also meaningful. How does a war correspondent get to write a book with a Fortune 500 CEO who runs the world's largest coffee company? It's an unlikely partnership that, for both of us, had its roots in events that took place over a series of some years. For me, it sort of begins about 11 years ago in Baghdad, Iraq, where I had been sent for the Washington Post to chronicle the initial American ground invasion and then the follow-on time of occupation of the military's effort to stabilize and rebuild the country, along with a team of civilian experts who had been dispatched from Washington. And before I get to For Love of Country, let me just set a little bit of context, because it was in those years in Iraq that I, as a civilian, as somebody who had not grown up living in a military community, had not grown up with family members who had served, had not myself served, first became exposed to our men and women in uniform and what they were doing and how they operated in the sands of a foreign country that was initially welcoming and then turned incredibly hostile. I had decided to spend a fair bit of time in those early months in Baghdad, in a place that would later become called the Green Zone, which is the seat of the American occupation there. And it was from there that the policies were developed that were supposed to guide the overall American effort and were supposed to stabilize the country. But instead of having a calming, constructive effect, what really transpired was a series of decisions that stoked instability and chaos in the country. We all know many of them. I won't go into great detail here, but it involved things like disbanding the entire Iraqi army, even those, and putting out of work even those many, many individuals who never sought to fight against the United States. It involved banning even low-level members of the Ba'ath Party from serving in government positions, rendering jobless many teachers and police officers and so forth. But it was from inside this bubble that a number of these decisions that were made that would come to not just bedevil that initial period, but have their echoes in the events today. The marginalization of Iraq's once ruling Sunni Arab community can be seen in the roots of the growth of ISIS, for instance, in Iraq and Syria. As I chronicled events inside this place called the Green Zone, it became very clear to me that we were doing some pretty absurd things. We were sending people who had absolutely no business being sent to rebuild a post-war Middle Eastern country. Instead of sending people with Arabic language skills, with expertise in post-conflict reconstruction, with some skills in basic municipal and civil administration. Too often, the previous administration here in Washington simply sent the loyal and the willing. Young kids whose parents were campaign donors, others who had been active in party politics or had worked for certain offices up on Capitol Hill or had worked for conservative-leaning think tanks in this town. And just to make sure they got the right people before they were shipped off there, they were asked questions like, what are your views on Roe versus Wade, and do you support capital punishment, and stuff that were, really important litmus tests to go out to a place like Iraq. They were all ensconced in this place called the Green Zone, which was really a little slice of America. Everybody drove around in brand new Chevy Suburbans. They had posted speed limit signs. They had a number of restaurants, a cafeteria that run by Halliburton that would serve things like hamburgers and cheeseburgers, and of course, kind of inexplicable to me, with many Muslim Iraqis also working as translators and other support personnel. Seemingly every meal seemed to have lots of bacon in it, which, as many of you know, is a food that observant Muslims do not like to eat. And then this combination of this weird place and these people gave us a whole host of head-scratching policies. There was an effort. This is, kind of while Baghdad is burning and improvised explosive devices are going off in the provinces, the team of Americans sets out to rewrite Iraq's tax code. Another works to try to bring elements of No Child Left Behind education policy to Iraq. And as I would go out and patrol with service members in the far western and northern parts of the country, they would just express this befuddlement at what their fellow Americans were doing and how disconnected the leadership was from the experience of the men and women out on the ground, the experience of the men and women who unfortunately at that point were getting shot at and bombed with all too common frequency. I came back to Washington after a couple of years out there and wrote a book about that wacky place called the Green Zone in an effort to try to help my fellow Americans better understand just what was at the root of the mismanagement that was occurring there. After a few more years of doing various things around the Washington Post, when President Obama took office, I decided it was time to go back to war again, and this time it was Afghanistan. And I spent a lot of time in southern Afghanistan, and as I traipsed through the deserts of southern Afghanistan with U.S. Marines, I, like they had to ford over these pretty daunting irrigation canals that were that seemed to sort of crisscross the deserts of Helmand province. And I began to ask, why are these canals here? Who put them there? And came to discover a remarkable story that again would help to inform my journalism and my understanding of not just the challenges that our troops were facing on the ground, but our fundamental lack of of history in understanding the places in which we seek to impose ourselves, often for very good reason, to respond to an attack on American soil. But one has to understand the history and context of the places in which we send our men and women in uniform. And so in southern Afghanistan, these canals were actually something, the product of a remarkable kind of twist of history. In the 1930s, as the Nazis were advancing across Europe, Jews who could flee did, and many of them, as we know, wound up in the United States, which opened its doors to Jewish refugees. Some of those who fled worked as fur traders. Now, in New York, in the late 30s, they needed a new source for pelts to make coats and hats. Their traditional markets in Europe were no longer accessible. So they turned, quite remarkably, to the landlocked nation of Afghanistan, whose hills abounded with Persian fat-tailed sheep. And they bought between 1 and 2 million of those a year. And the sales of those put all this money in the Afghan treasury. And so at the end of World War II, as Europe was digging out of its rubble, Afghanistan was sitting on a comparative windfall. It had $100 million in gold and silver reserves in its treasury. And they used that money, the Afghans did, to hire the best American engineering firm at the time, a firm called Morrison Knudsen, which built the Hoover Dam and would later go on to build Cape Canaveral down in Florida. Hired them to build these irrigation canals. And so the very canals that our troops were fighting in was part of an American development project that stretched back years. And it was a project that initially was welcomed by the Afghans. It was intended to turn a barren desert into a fertile oasis. It was the product of a deep friendship and a desire to really help vault Afghanistan into a slightly more modern existence. The project ran aground. It ran aground for a host of reasons, but among them, poor planning, contractors who sought to take more than they gave, unrealistic expectations of both the Americans as well as the Afghan leaders, a failure to understand the true dynamics of culture and life and expectation down at the provincial level. And the project essentially completely ran aground, and the Americans were forced to flee as Soviet tanks rolled in the late 1970s. And there was a great history here that as we went back into Afghanistan post 9/11, never bothered to understand. Materials in the Library of Congress and the files of the U.S. Agency for International Development. But as we re-engaged, we really failed to grasp that. And my curiosity, quite frankly, was piqued not just because I was getting wet up to my waist fording these canals, but because the Marines that I was spending time with, brave young Marine officers, as they sought to try to figure out how to stabilize Afghanistan in 2009 and 10, started to go back on the internet and read, and started to discover this stuff, and started asking themselves, why? Why isn't anybody shared this with us? What's the context in which we're operating? So I had come to this project with deep experience in both of these war zones, and I was back in Washington working on a landmark survey of our 9/11 veteran generation. We at the Post were doing this with the Kaiser Family Foundation, and it was the first time that anybody's really sought to broadly survey this generation of men and women who've gone to war. And what we discovered was some pretty remarkable stuff. Of the 2.6 million Americans we dispatched to fight, more than half told us that their mental or physical health is worse today than before they deployed. About 1 in 5 said that they were seriously injured while at war. That's almost 500,000 of our fellow Americans. 1 in 2 told us that they personally know of a fellow service member who tried or succeeded in committing suicide. And more than 1 million of them said that they suffer from relationship problems and outbursts of anger. But knowing all of that, when asked, would you do it all over again? 90% said yes. As I was going through this data, I happened to meet Howard Schultz here in Washington at the behest of a mutual friend. And I started to share this data with him, then unpublished. And we got onto another key fact. When we asked these young men and women about their connection to the country that they went off to fight for, 55% of them said they feel now disconnected from civilian life in America. It's sort of an eye-popping statistic. How could these men and women who we dispatched to fight for us come back to a society they feel so unmoored from? Well, the answer, in some ways, is relatively simple. It speaks to the great civilian-military divide in our society, when fewer than 1% of our fellow countrymen wear the uniform and get dispatched to war. And when you add their relatives in that mix, it's about 5% of our population. The vast majority of Americans really have no skin in the game. We were essentially told to go on with business as usual post 9/11. Nobody's made a collective sacrifice. People have been able to be blissfully disconnected from the lives and experiences, the hopes and fears, and the tragedies that have befallen those who have gone out to serve. Howard sort of came to that discussion from a different path. He hadn't served himself, though his dad had fought in the Second World War. He actually had never known anybody in the military prior to a couple of years ago. And for that, he told me he felt deeply ashamed. But he happened to, at the advice of a friend, bring on to the company's board of directors a guy by the name of Bob Gates, the former Secretary of Defense. And when Gates first came to Starbucks to meet with Howard, he expected the discussion to really be about coffee and the coffee business. And instead, they spent 2 hours talking about veterans. Gates sharing with Howard his worries that as the wars wind down, our nation, which had been so disconnected from these wars, would pay short shrift to our veterans as they sought to adjust into civilian life, sought to find civilian employment, and go on with their lives. And so he urged Howard to pay attention to this. Around that same time, one of our Medal of Honor recipients, one of our living Medal of Honor recipients from these modern wars, Sergeant Leroy Petrie, an Army Ranger, who bravely picked up a hand grenade that had been thrown in his direction and that of a few fellow Army Rangers in Afghanistan. He picked it up with his hand and he threw it back. His hand blew off. And he came and he addressed the employees at Starbucks. And hearing Leroy Petrie, hearing Bob Gates, Howard decided he'd take some action. So Starbucks decided that it would make a public commitment to hire 10,000 veterans and active duty military spouses. He decided to donate $30 million of his money to a variety of veterans-related causes. But neither of those steps, he felt, would really help address what he felt was this vast civ-mil divide in the country. And so that's how we came to collaborate on this book. He looked at me and said, look, we can try to do something here to tell the stories of these young men and women in ways that newspapers and television stations don't always do, and try to get it out to people in a non-traditional way. And so he wrote a book, For Love of Country, that was out last year. What was unique about it was that it wasn't just sold in bookstores and available on Amazon, but it was also available in 7,000 Starbucks locations, in an effort to try to get it in front of people who wouldn't normally pay much attention to the sacrifice and heroism of those who have served. We framed the book in two parts. The first half were stories of valor that occurred in Iraq and Afghanistan. Second half, stories of how this generation of veterans are coming back and plowing their leadership skills, their values, their ethics, their problem-solving abilities into doing some remarkable things on the home front, trying to push back against the stereotype that all of our veterans are broken, that they're ticking time bombs. Sure, many have come back with physical and mental scars. Make no mistake about it. But many, many of them are not just ready to join the workforce, but they are contributing members of American corporations, nonprofit organizations, government agencies, churches, schools, and other community organizations. We wanted to shine a light on that. So we set about this task last summer. Initially, the challenge, we had 2.6 million men and women who went to war. Countless numbers of them performed great acts of heroism. How to just winnow this down. So one of the things I did was I privately emailed a number of senior military leaders, both current and retired, and I asked them, off the record, in your time as leaders at war, you signed off on countless award packets nominating individuals for Bronze Stars, Silver Stars, Service Crosses, and in some cases, our nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor. Tell me the few that still stick under your skin today, acts of great valor. And so, without hesitation, my email box flooded in with replies, and I used it as a beacon to try to help guide the reporting. I found a guy by the name of Bill Krisoff. Bill Krisoff was a military dad. He was an orthopedic surgeon who lived in Reno, Nevada. He had 2 sons. Both of them went off to college, and then both decided to join the Marine Corps. His eldest son, Nate, became a counterintelligence officer, was deployed to the Iraqi city of Fallujah. Well, unfortunately, Nate was killed by a roadside bomb, the worst news a father could ever receive. And Bill, doctor, grieved for his son for weeks, and then decided he'd go back and practice medicine, do what he did, operate on people's bad backs and bum knees, which he did for a while. But after losing his oldest son, it no longer felt very meaningful. And he knew that roadside bombs were taking the lives of Nate's fellow Marines and other service members in Iraq. At this point, Dr. Krisoff was 60 years old, lived a good life. But he decided he wanted to try to help his country. So he called up a Navy recruiter, said, I'd like to join the Naval Reserve Medical Corps. They had a good conversation. Finally, the recruiter said, Sir, how old are you? He said, I'm 60. The guy almost laughed at him and said, You're 18 years too old to join the military. But Bill Krisoff couldn't get out of his mind. A couple months later, he got an invitation to attend a speech that President Bush would be delivering to the American Legion in Reno. And so he went, and as a Gold Star father, he and his wife and their other son, who's then a first lieutenant in the Marine Corps, were accorded an audience with the president. The president came into the small room next to the meeting hall and told the Gold Star parents how deeply he appreciated their sacrifice, and then said, look, if there's anything I can do, let me know. And one parent raised their hand and said, I got this problem with benefits paperwork, and Bush pledged to deal with it. Bill Krisoff went up to the president and said, Sir, there is one thing you can do. I'd like to serve, but they tell me I'm too old. No disrespect, Mr. President. I'm younger than you are. Bush summoned over Karl Rove, told him he was going to be meeting with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff 2 days in Crawford, Texas. Didn't make any promises, but said, we'll see what we can do. The day after Bush's meeting in Crawford, the very same recruiter who almost laughed at Bill Krisoff called him back up and said, Sir, I've got orders to meet with you by the end of the day today. And Bill Krisoff joined the Naval Reserve Medical Corps. Thought, most who were following his story in Washington thought, okay, great, what a remarkable father, joining the Navy after the death of his son. They thought, okay, he'd be going down to the Naval Hospital in San Diego 1 weekend a month and doing some knee scopes, dispensing some, back pain medication and doing something good for the country. Great. 2009, Bill Krisoff heard there was a need for an orthopedic surgeon in 2008, pardon me, he volunteered to go to Iraq. And he went there for 7 months and worked there. It was a quiet time in the war. He came back, hadn't even had time to unpack his bags, early 2009, when he heard there was an urgent need for an orthopedic surgeon in Afghanistan, in southern Afghanistan, where our Marines were surging in, where the sands of the ground were littered with anti-personnel mines. And so he went at age 63 for 7 months, slept in a tent with 10 other guys, and in those 7 months was either the primary or assisting trauma surgeon on 225 cases, saving the lives of countless American, British, and Afghan service members and civilians. It's a sort of guy who, quite frankly, represents a lot of other remarkable parents of those who have served our country. But Bill Kristof did something singular. We write about two young Marines, a guy named Jordan Harder and Jonathan Yale. They were from different Marine battalions. Jordan Harder, white kid from Long Island, grew up with a solidly middle-class existence, decided in his sophomore year in high school that he wanted to join the Marine Corps, the height of the violence in Iraq. He was a kind of a chubby kid who liked playing video games, and as soon as he made that decision, he started working out every day, was lean and fit, and joined a Marine battalion that would be heading to Iraq. Jonathan Yale was a half-black kid from rural Virginia, grew up dirt poor, joined the Marine Corps after high school, wanting to serve his country. He was in another battalion that had already spent 7 months in Iraq and was ready to come home. On John Yale's last day in Iraq and Jordan Harder's first day, 5 a.m., they were assigned together to stand guard at the entry point of a joint security station. It was a joint U.S. and Iraqi security outpost in the town of Ramadi. I write about this with Howard in the book, but nothing that I can write or Howard can write can compare to the words uttered by now Marine General John Kelly, who was then the top Marine commander in Iraq at the time. And I'm going to read you a couple of paragraphs of a speech he delivered. I should tell you for context that General Kelly delivered this speech 4 days after receiving word that his own son had been killed in Afghanistan. And also for context to tell you that in the aftermath of the explosion, the Marines would discover video imagery of what occurred from a security camera. You can watch the last 6 seconds of their young lives. Putting myself in their heads, I suppose it took about a second for the two Marines to separately come to the same conclusion about what was going on once the truck came into their view at the far end of the alley. Exactly no time to talk it over or call the sergeant to ask what they should do. Only enough time to take half an instant and think about what the sergeant told them to do only a few minutes before. Let no unauthorized personnel or vehicles pass. These two Marines had about 5 seconds left to live. It took maybe another 2 seconds for them to present their weapons, take aim, and open up. By this time, the truck was halfway through the barriers and gaining speed the whole time. Here, the recording shows a number of Iraqi police, some of whom had fired their AKs, now scattering like the normal and rational men they were, some running right past the Marines. They had about 3 seconds to live. For about 2 seconds more, the recording shows the Marines' weapons firing nonstop, the truck's windshield exploding into shards of glass as their rounds take it apart and tore into the body of the son of a bitch who was trying to get past them to kill their brothers, American and Iraqi, bedded down in the barracks, totally unaware of the fact that their lives at that moment depended entirely on two Marines standing their ground. If they had been aware, They would have known they were safe because 2 Marines stood between them and a crazed suicide bomber. The recording shows the truck careening to a stop immediately in front of the 2 Marines. In all of the instantaneous violence, Yale and Harder never hesitated. By all reports and by the recording, they never stepped back. They never even started to step aside. They never even shifted their weight. With their feet spread shoulder-width apart, they leaned into the danger, firing as fast as they could work their weapons. They had only 1 second left to live. The truck explodes. The camera goes blank. 2 young men go to their God. 6 seconds. Not enough time to think about their families, their country, their flag, or about their lives or their deaths, but more than enough time for 2 very brave young men to do their duty into eternity. That is the kind of people, Kelly told the crowd, who are on watch for you all over the world. So that's another chapter on the front of the book. Second half of the book are stories of what some of our veterans have done now that they've come home. We tell the tale of David Aucklander, former battalion commander of the Army in Afghanistan, commanded 100 paratroopers there. Came back, was stationed in the basement of the Pentagon at the National Military Coordination Center. He had a couple computer screens up on his desk, a couple classified systems and an unclassified systems. On his classified system, he was seeing daily reports of casualties in Afghanistan. On his unclassified system, because he'd sort of grown up in the Chicago area, he was sort of tracking news reports of violence, particularly gun violence among youth in Chicago. And what he'd come to recognize before it became sort of more widely known was that in 2010, more young people were killed in gun violence in Chicago than by the hands of the Taliban in Afghanistan, more Americans. And so he decided, after 20 years in uniform, that he was going to retire from the Army and try to help on the home front. He decided to become a teacher, eventually on path to becoming a school principal, initially in Chicago and now in inner city Detroit, deciding that he was going to leverage his military expertise, his leadership skills, his desire for service into a new venue. He could have gone on and gotten a well-paying job from a defense contractor, gone on to just live off of his military retirement pay, but instead he said that he needed to continue serving his country and take what he had learned, the lessons in leadership he had learned while in the service, and apply them on the home front. We close the book with a bit of a call to action, and if you'll indulge me, I'd like to read a couple more paragraphs and then we can take a few questions. The post-9/11 years have brought us the longest period of sustained warfare in our nation's history. We've met this unprecedented challenge with a small cadre of citizens who charged forth to serve so that the rest of us could go on with life as usual. We've asked so much of them and their families. The multiple year-long deployments that many uncomplainingly fulfilled often amounted to more time on the battlefield than their parents faced in Vietnam or their grandparents confronted in World War II. They missed birthdays and graduations, dance recitals, and Little League games. Many spent their tours in Iraq and Afghanistan under the constant threat of getting blown up. And yet we have sacrificed so little. In non-military families, fathers could play catch with their sons, and wives could dine with their husbands whenever they wanted. Mothers didn't have to spend sleepless nights wondering if their adult children would return home alive. For too long, too many of us have paid scant attention to the commitment of a brave few in our midst. It's unhealthy for a nation to become detached from those who secure it. Our volunteers have given the rest of us remarkable freedom, but that freedom comes with the responsibility to understand their sacrifice, to honor them, to appreciate what they can offer when they return home, to care for those who are wounded, and to mourn those who have given us their last full measure of devotion. As the war in Afghanistan winds down, it's tempting to see this as a moot issue. It's not. Our nation will continue to send men and women into harm's way for years to come, albeit in smaller tranches, as extremists bent on attacking the United States and our citizens abroad find safe haven in lawless parts of the Middle East and Africa. But the next phase of our wars is shifting to the home front. More than 1.5 million post-9/11 veterans have already taken off their uniforms and entered the civilian world. Another million will be following them in the next few years as enlistments end and budget cuts shrink our military. They deserve to enter a society that welcomes them with an appreciation and understanding of their sacrifice. In October 1945, the Saturday Evening Post published an issue with a Norman Rockwell painting on its cover. It was titled Homecoming Marine. Depicts a young Marine in his service khakis, a silver star ribbon affixed to his chest. He's holding a Japanese flag as he sits on a box in a garage. He's talking to 4 men and 2 boys, all of whom are paying rapt attention. General Martin Dempsey, our nation's top military officer, keeps a replica of that painting in his office. If Rockwell were to have illustrated a Marine returning from Vietnam, Dempsey told us, he would have had to show a crowd turning away. And if he'd been alive to capture a Marine upon his return from Afghanistan or Iraq, he likely would have portrayed people too caught up in their lives to listen to the veteran's story. We need the image of our returning veterans to look more like this, Dempsey said, putting his hand on that painting. They are to be admired because they chose to live an uncommon life in service of their country. The challenge is upon us. As we argue in this book, the time is now to start bridging the civilian-military divide, to demonstrate our collective potential to come together and do right by those who've done so much for us. They have stepped up, and now it is our turn. Thank you, and I'd be honored to take a few questions. Please come up to the microphones. Please.
Thank you. You mentioned that you did a survey of the veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, and when you asked them whether they would do it all over again, 90% of them said they would. Implied in that is that they really believed in the goals of the war, what we were going to achieve there, or were they doing it out of just a sense of patriotism?
We did not delve into their views in that question on the goals of the war. In other questions, we asked whether they believe that the wars were worthwhile. And while the veterans, in the case of both wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, answered at a higher percentage than non-veterans have typically answered those questions, it was still, particularly in the case of Iraq, well below 50% of veterans believe that. So you had individuals who had served in Iraq saying they didn't believe the war was worth fighting. But if asked as a member of the military to go and deploy, they said they would do it all over again. And I think it speaks to the loyalty and the sort of unflinching desire to do what is asked of them for those who take the oath and put on the uniform, wear the cloth of the nation. Thank you.
You spoke of vets who come back damaged or broken, and you must have quite a database of that. Have you done anything to try to find out what kinds of experiences are common to vets who are suicidal or who are damaged or broken psychologically? And if not, do you intend to do anything to find out whether there are things the military is doing or failing to do that could reduce this sort of thing, as we would normally do with guys who are injured physically in battle?
It's a very good question. We devote a chapter in the book to the story of General Peter Corelli, who was the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army and was a leading force within the Pentagon of trying to call attention to post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury, which was a leading cause of in these modern wars of ongoing physical and mental injury for our service members and those who've become veterans. What Corelli sought to do in uniform, as well as what he is now seeking to do as a private citizen in pushing the science forward, demonstrates remarkable leadership on this front. And so what we're trying to do, on one hand, is to illustrate that as an example of great leadership. work he's doing is, we hope, will lead to advances in treatment for those who are suffering from post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury. And as a adjunct to that, a good chunk of Howard's philanthropic contribution is going to support some of the work that General Corelli is doing with his One Mind Foundation. And I think, is that time? We have time for one last question. We'll make it quick.
Certainly. Good evening, and thank you for your talk and for your book. In this political season, there are actually incredulously calls to eliminate the VA as an agency. I wanted to know if you wanted to say any words about that as a prospect. What do you think of such a call? So,
thank you for that question. I should just note that now that I'm no longer a paid staff member of the Washington Post, I can, in the past I would have had to prevaricate on something like that. That is an asinine idea. Absolutely. The VA may be broken in many ways, but you don't deal with a broken bureaucracy by blowing it up. And I think Bob McDonald is making some very positive changes. There's a lot of work ahead of him, but you fix it, because taking care of our veterans is one of our most solemn obligations as a republic. Thank you.
Gentlemen, Rajiv Chandrasekaran.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good to see you again. He will be signing his books down in the author signing area from 6:30 to 7:30 if you'd like to get down there. We have one more session, but let me just say this, that we have someone else to thank, that for those of you who've been through all of our sessions today, or maybe just this one, Jacqueline B. Mars' gift made this all possible. So let's give a round of applause for the benefactors for this program.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.